So, Brad and Natalie and Greg have been leading us through the life of Christ this year. And I'm going to continue in that vein, but I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Jesus is now grown, and he's entered his ministry. And he's had a long time to observe the religious world around him. And apparently the Jews, and Jesus was a Jew, and there's enough anti-Semitism around that we need to continue to remind ourselves of that. Apparently the Jews were a religiously obsessed people. And so we find him teaching in Mark 12:38. As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses for the sake of appearance, and for the sake of appearance, they say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." So let's look at this passage a little more closely. Let's look at the word "the." In my Bible, it's the 8th word in. And after an intense study of my Greek lexicon, I've come to be convinced that the word "the" actually means "the." And so now that we've established beyond a shadow of a doubt that I have a biblical basis for what I want to share, what I really want to talk about are the Oakland Raiders. The Oakland Raiders are apparently hell-bent, and I use that word very deliberately, on becoming the Las Vegas Raiders. And if that's not a crime against humanity, I don't know what is. But at least we still have the A's, the pride of the working class. Did you know that all Giants fans are snobs? They're elitist. They're afraid of the salt-to-the-earth types that lived in Oakland like I did for 5 years. They all sit there drinking champagne and having manicures while they watch sailboats on the bay, and they think they're at a baseball game. While A's fans sit in the Oakland Coliseum and watch fights. Oh, well, never mind. What I've just done is something that's pretty common in the sermonizing world, and that's called proof texting. And if you've ever taken a biblical interpretation class, you've learned that that's a no-no. Unfortunately, many Christians hear it done almost nearly every Sunday in their church. This church is an exception. Brad doesn't proof text much. Proof texting simply means that you use the Bible to talk about anything you want to, as long as you somehow connect what you want to talk about to a Bible verse. So back to our text. In a way, I think this morning I am proof texting a little, because Jesus says, "Beware of the scribes." And what I really want to talk about are the Pharisees. And I think I'm on pretty solid ground here, because scribes and Pharisees are often linked together in the Gospels. In fact, many of the scribes were Pharisees. But I guess if I'm going to talk about the scribes and Pharisees, then I'll have to be confessional. I was reading Francois Fenelon in my morning devotions, and I ran across this passage. Fenelon was a 17th century French priest and spiritual writer. He actually has several good books that a lot of people for the last couple of hundred years have found really helpful to them. Anyway, Francis Fenelon says this: "You dishonor true love by supposing that it is concerned about the insignificant things that continually occupy your attention. And so Satan is transformed into an angel of light. He assumes a form of legalistic love and an oversensitive conscience. You should know by now that the troubles he will lead you into if he convinces you to be a Pharisee. And so resist and reject his advances." So in my smugness, while I was reading that, I congratulated myself on not being a Pharisee, until I was struck by the thought that my smugness and my self-righteousness is a pretty good guarantee that I actually am one. And apparently, Jesus doesn't have very nice things to say about people like me. In fact, he says to beware of us. So I didn't leave my devotional time inspired. I left it chastened. And then I asked myself a question that had been bothering me ever since. How did I turn into a Pharisee? When did I become one? Now, this message might not be as linear as I would like it. That's a problem for me as a history professor, although I guess it's not a problem for philosophy, and I teach some philosophy too. Life isn't particularly linear, and this sermon's not going to be either, but that bothers me because us Pharisees are very linear people. We like to draw with straight lines. So why is Phariseeism a problem? And why is it a problem for me? First of all, most of us probably know who I'm talking about if we've been around church for a while, about who the Pharisees were. They're sort of the foils for Jesus in a lot of his earthly ministry. One author says the following about them. I think they're misunderstood. I've always felt misunderstood. I think Pharisees are misunderstood. One author says the Pharisees were the moral, social, and spiritual authorities of their day. And they didn't get to that position of authority simply through good luck. Pharisees were quite amazing people. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. They were the moral and spiritual guardians of the people. They were the pillars of the community. They stood for something. They stood for purity. They stood for faithfulness. They stood for strong institutions and strong families. They were the people who were willing to do whatever was necessary to see that their community held together. And so, pray tell me, what's wrong with that? They're the good guys. But apparently, in their interactions with Jesus, they come across quite differently. Another simpler, less New Testament-y phrase that means the same thing as a Pharisee is someone who is self-righteous, who has a superior attitude, who's holier than thou, someone who's convinced somehow that they're better than other people. There's an old story about someone who fell into a pit and the reactions of different people to that fact. I think the list is funny, and I nod my head knowingly with my self-satisfied smirk until I get to the end of the list. It seems there was a man who fell into a pit and he couldn't get himself out. And so an empathetic person came along and he said, I feel for you down there. And then an objective person walked by and he said, it's logical. There's a pit there. It's logical that someone would fall into the pit. A mathematician came by and he calculated how deep the pit was. A news reporter came by and he wanted the exclusive story of the man who fell into a pit. An IRS agent came by and asked if the man was paying taxes on the pit that he fell into. A self-pitying person said, you haven't seen anything until you've seen my pit. A fire and brimstone preacher said, you deserve your pit or you wouldn't be down there. A Christian scientist said, the pit is just in your mind. A psychologist noted, your mother and your father are to blame for you being in that pit. A self-esteem therapist said, believe in yourself and you can climb out of the pit. And then a Pharisee said, only bad people fall into pits and you sure wouldn't see me down there. So why am I apparently in one? Why am I apparently in a pit? I have a superiority complex. I'm a perfectionist. But as someone once said, if you were perfect, you could deal with the imperfections of others without letting them bother you. So I guess I'm not quite as much of a perfectionist as I think I am. I'm always judging other people. I'm obsessed with the speck in their own eye without paying attention to the log that's in my eye, which interestingly enough doesn't let me see anything else about the other person except for their speck. And that might be the most tragic thing of all about being a Pharisee. I desperately need to ensure that God isn't giving anyone else any slack. How dare they get away with that? But of course I have major log in my own eye issues, as we all do. One of my favorite stories about our sometime refusal to see our own issues because of our imagined superiority involves an American general who found himself in the same men's room as an Iranian general at the UN building in New York City. Some of you may have heard this story before. I'm going to edit it just a little bit. The two generals were quietly relieving themselves at the urinal. That's usually what happens in bathrooms, in case you didn't know. And the American found that he couldn't resist the opportunity to have a dig at his Iranian counterpart. He said, I hear that Ayatollah of yours doesn't mind a bit of a drink. I know he's publicly opposed to alcohol, but I hear that in private he hits the bottle pretty hard. And the Iranian general laughed it off and he said, oh, is that right? So the American general tried again. I also hear that he has quite a few women with him. In addition to however many wives he has, I hear he's got quite a harem. All hush-hush, of course. And the Iranian says, so is that what you hear? So the American thinks he'll try one final dig. He says, I hear that your Ayatollah is thinking about becoming a Christian, becoming one of us. Had you heard that? And the Iranian says, well, from what you've been telling me, that seems to be exactly what's happening to him. Ouch. Ouch. But here's the rub. There's just one little problem. I am better than everybody else, and my humility is the proof of it. It's empirically demonstrable. You can put it in a test tube. It's verifiable. Holy moly. See, I'm so holy, even my moly's holy. Actually, you have to be married to a Mexican American to know what that's about. So how did it ever come to this? How did I ever get here? Holier than thou, a Pharisee. Patty once said to me that I was the most cynical, negative person that she knew. In fact, one time she called me a self-righteous prick. Now, I must certainly be holier than Patty is, because I would never call anybody a prick. So what happened? How did I become this way? What is it about our Pharisees? Why am I going on with this litany of proof about my deluded self-righteousness? As you can probably tell, I'm not the only one who's like that. The church is full of people like me now, and it's always been. People who always think that the preacher's talking about the other person and not me. You sure preached to them that day, right? Instead of your sermon convicted me. We're everywhere. We're the reason why too many people say, oh, those Christians, aren't they the ones that hate? And then you fill in the blank. You fill in the blank. So I guess to my infinite chagrin, it's pretty well established that I'm a Pharisee. But I really don't want to be one. I really don't want to be a Pharisee. If for nothing else, there's a real desire in me to be Christ-like, and that's warring with my inner Pharisee. And I know that Jesus wants something better for me too. But here's what worries me. Here's what worries a lot of people like me. How do you keep your integrity without judging, or at least making value judgments? How do you not lapse into relativism? Aren't some things just right and some things wrong? And aren't we supposed to be about that is right and not be around that which is wrong? At school, in a class that I teach, we talk about postmodernism. And it's a very complicated philosophical and cultural phenomenon. But most people, even if they don't know much about what postmodernism or postmodernity is or isn't, they know one thing about it, that most postmodernists apparently feel that truth is relative. It's whatever you want it to be. They realize that there's a lot of different ideas in this world, and there's a lot of people that have a lot of systems. And so how is it possible to be able to say one system is right and one system is wrong? And how can you be a Christian in a postmodern world where folks don't think there really is something that's right or wrong? How do you avoid being a relativist? Is the only choice we have becoming a Pharisee again? Isn't the opposite of self-righteousness something like anything goes? Like it's all cool? Isn't there something worse than Phariseeism? Isn't standing up for truth and righteousness important? Isn't it other people's problems that they think I'm a Pharisee just for standing up for God's way? But then there's that pesky little verse where Jesus talks about people like me. And it's not the only one. Jesus talks about the Pharisees. I may think that it's everybody else's problem, but Jesus says it's mine. So I don't want to be a Pharisee. And I suspect that a few of the budding Pharisees in our midst this morning really don't want to be Pharisees either. So how do we get ourselves out of this trap, out of this pit? What do we do to avoid what seems to be this vicious circle of judging and self-righteousness? Well, I think the main antidote to Phariseeism is found in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. And that's Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And particularly in the Beatitudes, where Jesus remarks about what kind of people are blessed, and apparently there's not a shred of Phariseeism in there with what kind of people are blessed. Someone once remarked, and I think it's a really good idea, we have some cultural and political struggles about having like the 10 Commandments on courthouse walls, right? But no one ever wants to put the Beatitudes on a courthouse wall, which is really interesting, right? No one wants to put this stuff. But Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those that hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, because they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And I don't think it's talking about Pharisees there. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. That certainly is not a Pharisee. Pharisees want to be thought very well of by everybody. Rejoice and be glad, Jesus says, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets that were before you. In Luke chapter 11, verse 17, Jesus says, when he looks out at people, some Pharisees, and knowing their thoughts, he said, every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and a divided household falls. Phariseeism divides. Grace unifies. And there's enough kingdom work to do without jockeying for position as to who gets the best seat at the celestial banquet or the wedding supper of the Lamb. Some of you might have heard this story before, but I have to say it again. I love it. There was a man that was standing at the edge of a bridge, and he was about to jump. He was about to commit suicide. And a passerby tried to talk him down. And so he said, well, aren't you a Christian? And the man answered, well, yes. And so the passerby said, great, me too. What kind of Christian are you? Orthodox? Catholic? Protestant? And the answer was Protestant. Me too. What kind of Protestant? Anglican? Baptist? Presbyterian? Methodist? Pentecostal? And the man answered, Pentecostal. And then the rescuer got really excited. Me too. Are you an initial evidence Pentecostal or a third wave Pentecostal? Initial evidence. Me too. What kind of initial evidence? Are you an AOG, a CRC, a COC, a CCC? And the man said, I'm an AOG. And now the man got really excited that was going to rescue him. He said, me too. Are you post-trib, pre-trib, or all-millennial? And the guy on the bridge, feeling that life was worth living now, said, all-millennial. And with that, the passerby, becoming very angry, screamed, die, heretic. And he pushed him off the bridge. Phariseeism divides. Grace unifies. I also think that Phariseeism is pretty dangerous, actually, in churches and in individual lives. One thing I talk about in the same sort of class that Brad teaches, Christian Perspective, is about the phenomenon of global Christianity. I know a couple students here have heard me talk about that. The fact that, and I don't think it's going to take me a long time to convince you of this, that there are places in the world where Christianity is growing a lot faster than it is in the West right now. In fact, Christianity is declining in the West. But it's growing in what we used to call the third world, but now I guess we call it the global South, because most of it's south of the equator, right? And there are independent churches that have grown up in Africa and in South America, and they are some of the largest and most growing Christian churches in the world. And they aren't birthed out of American or European mission money or missionaries or anything. They just started themselves. How dare they actually just start themselves? And some of us who care about these things are a little chagrined at some of the stuff that goes on in some of these churches and some of the things they teach. And so the question is, they're not asking me because they don't depend on my money or upon my support to grow, like the first Christian churches didn't either. And then I circle back to myself and who should be the judge theologically about what goes on there. And of course, it's me, an overeducated, ordained up the wazoo, middle-class, white American male. I should be able to say what is and what isn't theologically correct. Interestingly enough, a lot of these groups think that they actually live in the biblical worldview a lot more than we do, which is really, really interesting. We're always judging who gets to decide about these things. It turns out that the practices, the spiritual disciplines that we allow God to build into our lives, the spiritual different disciplines that prepare the soil of our hearts for the fruit of the Spirit to grow, are the same things that help us ward off Phariseeism. Silence. I have a big problem with silence. Silence is a good remedy for Phariseeism. You don't always have to have the last word. Now, that doesn't mean you don't say anything. Silence could be smugness, but that's not what I'm talking about. Silence can create space for others to flourish. I have real problems with silence. If anybody's ever had a class with me, I'll ask a question, and the students will think it's rhetorical because I'll answer it within 30 seconds. But it's actually not a rhetorical question. I just can't stand silence. I just can't stand waiting around for somebody to say something. If there's blank space, I somehow need to fill it somehow. I need to fill that space as if that space is mine to fill. That's why I'm not a very good Socratic teacher. I don't think Socrates answered all of his own questions. That's why they call them dialogues and not monologues. I've always wanted to be, though. Silence is a good remedy. I actually have in here, stay silent for 30 seconds and see what happens in the congregation. But I'm actually not going to do that because I already know what will happen. We'll all get nervous, actually, even with 30 seconds. But silence allows God to speak, and silence allows people to flourish. I'm not suggesting we become like the Quakers, but you know that in Quaker meetings, at least back in the old days, they actually had an unstructured silence. And when the Holy Spirit gave a message for somebody to speak, then they'd speak. And if it didn't, well, then they just wait around until the inner light came, right? I mean, I can't even imagine what that would be like, actually. We need to fill our space with something, but silence is good. Practice silence. Practice forgiveness. Practicing forgiveness is an antidote to Phariseeism. Forgiveness from below, not from above, which means I know God's going to forgive you, but I need to forgive you too. And most of all, I need to learn to forgive myself. Don't get depressed when you fail. So you were never supposed to fail? Oftentimes God has more patience with us than we do with ourselves. Phariseeism rests on the delusion that we are perfect or something. A Pharisee thinks that he or she can actually transform themselves. That's why self-help books are a multi-million-dollar industry. And honestly, if someone would write the self-help book that would end all self-help books, then everybody would buy that and you wouldn't have to buy anymore. But obviously, there's a new one coming out every 15 minutes. You can apparently never get enough of that in our self-improvement projects. Philip Yancey once said that perfectionism keeps running aground on the barrier reef of original sin. I really like that. Original sin, somehow Pharisees think that applies to everybody else but them. But of course, it applies to all of us. So silence and forgiveness and humility or meekness. Francois Fenelon again, he says, your temper, these are letters that he was actually writing for spiritual direction, if any of you have ever read some of this stuff. Your temper is not your biggest problem because you already distrust it. In spite of your attempt to control your temper, it still gets the better of you. This humiliation does you good. So worry about your more dangerous faults. I would rather see you obviously impatient and lacking a certain amount of self-control. This is more humiliating for you and better for killing your pride. When you are too perfect at controlling yourself, you can become harsh, judgmental, and too easily offended by other people. I'm talking about real humility, not humility that you choose when you want to be humble in your time and your place. And sometimes God will send you a dose of humility. when you need it. So my first, well, it's not my first ministry experience. When I was a senior in college, I was youth pastor at a local church. I was the worst youth pastor that ever existed. I'll tell you that right now. So I certainly wouldn't hire me as a youth pastor, but that's a long time ago. I was a summer missionary, which, in the Baptist world that I grew up in, they would send college students for a summer to help out some churches in, I guess, what were mission fields. And growing up Southern Baptist, Wisconsin was a mission field, right? So there was a church up there. I spent all summer right outside of Milwaukee. And people thought pretty highly of me, and I guess I was starting to think pretty highly of myself. And since it's a Baptist church, the last week I was up there, they had a potluck meal for me. And some of the kids in the church were running around, and they were putting ice down the back of people. And so I thought I would actually take some ice and put it down their back. And when I was running around the table, my leg hit the table that all the food was on, and everything in the potluck smashed to the floor. And I didn't feel like a Pharisee then, actually. I felt like an idiot. I needed that dose of humility. I wish I didn't, but I do. Meekness. Meekness means being controlled by God. It doesn't mean weakness, but frankly, so what if it does? Do we think that we aren't weak? Do we think that we don't need a Savior? I'm not talking about mindless tolerance of sin in ourselves or in others or in institutions or in structures. What I am talking about is allowing God to build an awareness of grace in our lives and seeing other people and ourselves through the lens of that grace, letting God expand our vision. Richard Foster said, you see, I actually have this on a little 3x5 card that I keep in my Bible. So you see, we are utterly dependent on God to do this transforming work in us. The work of heart purity and soul conversion and inward formation and life transformation. This solitary and interior work within the heart is the most important, the most real, and the most lasting reality in human life. And Jesus knew that. It's all over his teaching. I've nodded history and philosophy here, but I was an English major as an undergraduate. And so I'd like to close by ending with a short story, or the whole short story, the ending of a short story by one of my favorite authors. She was a Christian. She's sort of a Southern Gothic writer. Her name was Flannery O'Connor. Some of you have read some of her stories. And she writes one story about a very self-righteous person called Mrs. Turpin. And I would like to read you the ending of that story. In fact, I love this ending so much to keep me from my inner Pharisee that I actually have it written down and I have it over my desk in my office at Jessup. She says, until the sun slipped finally behind the tree line, this is the end of that story. Mrs. Turpin remained there with her gaze bent to the trees as if she was absorbing some abysmal, life-giving knowledge. At last, she lifted her head, and there was only a purple streak in the sky cutting through a field of crimson and leading like the extension of a highway into the descending dusk. And so she raised her hands from the side of the pig pen she was in a gesture heroic and profound. A visionary light settled in her eyes. She saw the streak as a vast swinging bridge extending upward from the earth through a field of living fire. And upon it, a vast horde of souls were tumbling towards heaven. I actually love that phrase, tumbling towards heaven. There were whole companies of white trash, clean for the first times in their lives. And bands of black folks in white robes and battalions of freaks and lunatics shouting and clapping and leaping like frogs. And bringing up the end of the procession was a tribe of people whom she recognized at once as those who, like herself, had a little bit of everything and the God-given wit to use it right. So she leaned forward to observe them closer. They were marching behind the others with great dignity, accountable as they had always been for good order and common sense and respectable behavior. They alone were singing on key. Yet she could see by their shocked and altered faces that even their virtues were being burned away as they tumbled towards heaven. God was stripping them of their Phariseeism. St. Ignatius Loyola has a prayer that I try to pray, but it's really hard for me to pray. And before we get ready to take communion, I'd like to I'd like to read it for you. So if the band would like to come up. He says, receive, Lord, all of my liberty. Accept, too, my memory and my understanding and my whole will. Whatever I have, all that I possess, it is you that gave them to me. And to you I return them entirely. Rule them now with your will. Only give me your love and your grace. And this is all that I ask and all that I need. This is my prayer for myself. It's my prayer for all of us. We're going to be partaking of communion in a moment. There's a phrase you've heard all of your lives if you've been in church. It's that the ground is level at the foot of the cross. It's level at the foot of the cross. In the church I grew up in, we always passed the elements, but here we come forward in a line. And I'm glad we do. We stand in line the same way Christians have for 2,000 years all over the world. The happy, the discouraged, those that feel close to God, those that feel distant, the sinners, the saints, the recovering Pharisees. All of us who know that as we partake of the Lord's Supper, we are aware of the grace that propels us forward in the Christian life. A grace wholly undeserved, but freely given in Jesus Christ. As we take communion together, we will dip the elements in the grape juice, take it back to our seats, and we'll all take it together at the end. Will you stand? Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 says, "For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus on the night when he was betrayed took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he said, 'This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' And in the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this in remembrance of me as often as you drink it. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" Let's take it together. And so, Lord, receive all of our liberty and accept our memory and our understanding and our whole will. Whatever we have, whatever we possess, we know that it is you that gave it to us. And to you we return it entirely. Rule it all now with your will. Only give us your love and your grace. And this is all we ask, and it's all we need. For your grace is truly amazing. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Give a handshake or a hug or whatever it is we do at the end of the service here.